Is that all? Anyway, folks, sorry about that. We're trying to play a wee video game, but we seem to be having a couple of issues with it, which we shall have to have a look at. Anyway, thank you very much for coming in. Welcome back. Just before we start, I want to give a wee shout out to a team in England who are very, very close friends of GSI. They just got officially put onto Paraflix late this afternoon. So you'll probably recognise them. They've been on our panel quite a few times, and we're meeting up with them in Pendle when we go down July. So it's just to say a quick congratulations to John and Ralph and all the rest of the team. We think it's amazing. So well done, folks. But anyway, back to tonight. And hi, Misty. Hi, Sam. So welcome to Forgotten Pendle Part 2, the final part. We're a lovely Pendle team, as always, and our special guest, Mr. Top Hat Tours himself, Mr. Simon Entwistle is with us. Thomas will be joining us very shortly. So just to kick off the evening, we're going to ask Simon just to give us a wee recap of what happened in Forgotten Pendle Part 1. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll finish off with the Good Friday meeting that took place on Good Friday, 1612, in the Forest of Pendle. The whole idea of this meeting, apparently, was to get a potion together to blow the gates of Lancaster City Castle open and rescue Elizabeth Southern, Anne Whittle, Alison Device, and indeed Demdike. But nothing actually happened. What did happen is word reached the ears of the local magistrate, Roger Noel, that a meeting had taken place, and he gave orders that every single person that attended should be arrested. When word filtered from the Forest of Pendle about these imminent arrests, two people, Christopher Howgate and his wife Barbara, just disappeared. But in doing so, they saved their lives. The ones that were successfully arrested were Jeanette Preston of Gisborne, West Yorkshire, Catherine Hewitt of Cone, Elizabeth Devise, James Devise, and Jeanette Devise of Malkin Tower, this little stone cottage in the Forest of Pendle, along with John and Jane Bulcock and this very, very brave lady called Alice Nutter. They were all sent to the city of Lancaster, with the exception of the two Jeanettes. Jeanette Preston came from Gisborne, West Yorkshire, so therefore she was sent to the city of York and paraded in front of the York City magistrates. Her husband went with her, villagers went with her, and they begged for her release. But the judges said, "I'm sorry, the king has signed her death warrant. She was dead before she arrived here." And she was found guilty of the murder of her employer, Mr. Thomas Lister. She had been nursing him. He had died. She wrapped his body in a clean white sheet ready for burial. And 2 days before the burial, she touched the sheeting. And some fresh blood came from the sheet. This was classed as witchcraft. She was also found guilty of attending the Good Friday meeting at Malkin Tower in Lancashire. And she became the very, very first of the Pendlers to be executed on the 27th of July, 1612, in the city of York. The other Jeanette, well, she was only a little girl. She was sent, apparently, to live with the local magistrates. And for the very, very first time, she'd received 3 meals a day, nice clothes to wear, and a lovely warm bed to sleep in. She probably had no idea, but she was going to play a very, very important role in the prosecution of her entire family. The local magistrate, Roger Noel, was delighted. He wrote to the king and told the king he had witches waiting to be tried in the city of Lancaster. The king wrote back and said he was delighted and was going to send 2 circuit judges, James Altham, Edmund Bromley, and a young boy called Thomas Potts. And that's why we're here tonight, really, because without Thomas Potts, I don't think we'd have any window into this whole story. Because in 1613, he wrote a book called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in Lancashire, which has become an international bestseller. We have to rely on that book being honest and truthful, as it's the only window in the whole story. What we do know is that when he wrote this book, he would be under a lot of duress, because the one thing he couldn't do, of course, was upset the King of England. We know the whole jury consisted just of men, and you could say that there's a lot of male chauvinism at that period of time. The courts assembled in August of that year. Elizabeth Southern, commonly known as Demdike, actually passed away before the trials began. but apparently she admitted to the murder by witchcraft of the two Robinsons and indeed the child of Richard Baldwin. She apparently admitted to witchcraft, and to add to all this, young Jeanette Devise was brought into the courts and put on top of her desk so the jury could see her. And there she told the jury how she'd seen these dogs arrive at Malkin Tower, Tib, Ball, Fancy, Dandy, and how these dogs apparently had been the devil in disguise and were indeed their familiars, and how these dogs had told them to make clay pictures and kill various people, etc., etc. Her mother, Elizabeth, was in court that day, and her mother shouted, "Stop it, Jeanette! You don't know what you're saying." Have my mother removed from the court. She's upsetting me. And her mother was taken back down to the cells, but her mother was found guilty of witchcraft. And she certainly went to her death, probably a very, very sad woman. James Devise was brought up, and that poor lad was lapsing in and out of consciousness. And the jury was concerned that he had actually been tortured. He was in a terrible, terrible state of health, but he had actually self-incriminated, but also brought information to the courts relating to his family as well. So he could say that he signed his own death warrant, but was found guilty of the murder of John Duckworth, Anne Townley, and Hugh and Blaise Hargreaves of Goldshaw Booth by making these clay pictures, and how this dog called Ball, his familiar, had told him to do so. So therefore, he had self-incriminated. Young Alison Devise, well, she was convinced that she had indeed paralysed John Law, the Halifax peddler. And in the court, the judges said, "Look, is there any way you could reverse this curse? Only my grandmother can do that, sir, and she is dead." For me personally, the people I felt very, very sorry for that day would be John and Jane Bulcock and this lady called Alice Nutter. The three of them were basically landowners. John and Jane were farmers, and Alice, there's a lot of mystery surrounding this poor woman, because she came from this rather gorgeous place called Roughly Hall, which is still there to this very, very day. And it has been said, never confirmed or denied. My grandmother used to tell me stories as a child. She came from Nelson, which is very, very near Cone, and she mentioned that Alice had had a huge problem with land disputes, and how she'd upset the local magistrate with demanding land disputes, and how Roger Nowell had found her and John and Jane Bulcock a bit of a nuisance, really. And therefore he had his trump card up his sleeve, which was this little girl called Jeanette Devise. And Jeanette was, again, for the second time, picked up and put on top of her desk, and she told the jury how she'd seen the Good Friday meeting take place, and how she'd seen John and Jane Bulcock and Alice Nutter there. The three of them made pleas of not guilty, but were found guilty of witchcraft. In the case of John and Jane, the murder by witchcraft of a young girl called Jean Mead of Harrogate in West Yorkshire by turning her insane. In the case of Alice Nutter, she was found guilty by the courts of the murder of Henry Mitten of Roughly because he wouldn't give her a penny, and also being in the company of Alison Devise and Elizabeth Southern. She made a plea of not guilty. Many people believe that she may have been a Catholic and had been harbouring a Catholic priest. We do know that in the courts that day, they brought in a identity parade, and she was put into the identity parade because the judges couldn't understand why a noblewoman was actually being arrested that day. However, young Jeanette did pick her out as being there at the Good Friday meeting. The Pendwitches were then brought out to the gallows, and they had to stand on trestles with ropes around their necks. It has been said, never denied or confirmed, that poor Alice, as she mounted the rostrum that day, she had a rope around her neck, and she looked down and saw Roger Nowell holding the hand of the little girl, Jeanette Devise. And there was this huge roar as the trestles were kicked up underneath them. These poor people did not hang. They literally strangled to death. It must have been a very, very painful and traumatic death, really. We do know that young Jeanette survived. You could say she'd helped the courts and she'd helped Roger Nowell to convict her family and indeed the landowners and indeed Catherine Hewitt of Cone. But we know that 3 years later she was rearrested. A young boy called Edmund Robinson said he'd been walking for the forest of Pendle and seen her commit acts of witchcraft. And of course, with her family reputation, this was taken very, very seriously. And she was arrested. The poor girl was taken to Lancaster. She was stripped naked, examined, then sent down to the City of London, examined, stripped naked, looking for suckling marks on her body, etc. Back to Lancaster, down to London, and after 3 years of going up and down the country, this young boy Robinson said, "I'm sorry, I made it all up. I didn't see her do anything." So you could say that witchcraft, or the superstition surrounding witchcraft, absolutely destroyed that poor girl's life, and indeed the inhabitants of the forest of Pendle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Who's got an echo? Somebody's got an echo. We've got an echo. We apologise for the echo. People appears to be us this time. Simon, as always, you can sit and listen to you all night the way you tell your stories, where you draw somebody into it.
I think
Joe.
it's been you.
What?
Are you back?
Did you mute me there?
No.
No.
We're having connection issues for some reason.
Did everybody hear me? No.
No.
We seem to be having a couple of problems. Sorry, folks.
To be fair, it was me this morning.
It's you this morning, it's us tonight. Sorry about this, folks. But hey, Joan, Nick, Mr. Cat, Sam's in, Andy Murphy, John Madison's in. Just say hi. So, as always, as I said, we're doing the second part of Forgotten Pendle, which, if you've been watching over the past few weeks, Shelley, Carl and Joe have been doing their daytime specials. Who were they? Where they've been telling you about various characters connected to the whole story. Some main characters, some of them behind the scenes, for want of a better word, that not a lot of people know about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let our Pendle team, as I come to know them, carry on with part two.
Brilliant. So, do you want to start?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Simon, for in a nutshell, a whistle-stop tour through what happened from leaving the brood of that dark hill to an even darker place where they were walked 42.5 miles. Now, we know that the four that were arrested first and incarcerated in Lancaster, I'm unclear as to they were walked or if they were transported by horse and cart. But I definitely know that the later ones that were arrested were walked from Newchurch, we'll say for argument's sake, to the gates of Lancaster Castle. They then went through those gates to a place that was known and still is known as the Well Tower. Now let's go back to where they lived, just mentioning very briefly that they lived in a place called Malkin Tower. Sounds very grand, doesn't it? Except Malkin Tower isn't very grand at all, because Malkin in 1612 was a Slatin word for something a little less polite. It was a Slatin word for shit. No other way we can explain it apart from the term, the word. So the Well Tower, you would think it was somewhere quite grand. And don't get me wrong, the Well Tower is majestic and it's strong and it's part of the forthold of Lancaster Castle. A tower that it is. Were they kept in the tower? That they were. But they were kept in the dungeon of this tower. These men and women from Pendle who'd left this beautiful open breadth of countryside were incarcerated 30 foot below ground level, with nothing but each other, darkness, death, stench, rotting flesh, and each other for company. Now, I know that we, as the Pendle team, as we've kind of gained the nickname, have spoke in chats with each other about, and in our daytime lives, about what it must have been like down there. And I know, Karen, you give quite a detailed explanation in your book, but you describe obviously York Castle.
Yes,
But again,
Murder by Witchcraft, which talks about Janet Preston, and that is set at York Castle. But to be honest, I think Lancaster Castle was worse.
okay, can you give us your description of what you believed it to be like?
Yes, well, they would have been in a terrible state by the time they got there. Not only tired, they'd been shackled and bound together. So the arms and wrists would have been covered in welts and sores and bruises. The feet would have been covered in blisters because they would not have had good shoes to walk all that length.
Any shoes.
Or any shoes, indeed, yes. And the roads would not have been as roads are like today that we know. They would have been the original lanes and tracks, so full of stones and pulled along, and they would have already been, just as I said, just a terrible state by the time they got there. They then, when they arrived in Lancaster, obviously the big city, none of them would have been there before. And if they'd gone anywhere, the largest town they'd have been to was Blackburn, possibly Preston. But then to go to Lancaster, which was a city, and then to see the imposing Lancaster Castle, which is really the archetypal castle stronghold. It goes right back to Norman times. It held off attacks by the Scots. It was John of Gaunt's stronghold. Imposing turrets, battlements, portcullis and entrance. So that would have completely awed them, and they would have seriously known they were in serious trouble. And then it got worse again, because then they were taken to the tower and they went down and down and down into the absolute pitch black, presumably still shackled together at the moment, not being able to see the person in front, so they'd have been bumping into each other. If they'd all made it down to the bottom on their feet, I'd be very surprised. I can imagine they would have just one misstep by one of them and they'd have all fallen in a heap at the bottom, still shackled together. So arms, shoulders wrenched, knees jarred, possibly even bones broken, who knows. And then they were chained to bolts in there, again, pitch black, although there would have been, I suppose, lantern lights from the jailers who would have come in behind them so that they couldn't try anything. So shackled up, nothing like beds or cots or even straw mattresses. At the most, there'd have been piles of straw, as you do for the animals in the cattle shed or the stables, and with less care taken. And there they would have stayed in the pitch black, terrified, hurt, exhausted, but at least together, which is something, unless they turned on each other. Because as we know, two of the families, Demdike's family and Chattox's family, they did not get on, and there was a lot of bad blood between them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it would not have been a very nice situation, and that I don't think there's anything comparable to it today. Certainly not in this country.
No. So Simon, can I just ask you then, how long were they kept in those conditions for?
I understand the arrests were April, about 18th, 19th of April, right up to the 17th of August. And I understand that when Anne Whittle was brought up from the Well Tower, she saw daylight for the very, very first time since April. I believe that she was nicknamed Chattox because the poor woman was so scared her teeth were chattering together. And it was a pretty cruel nickname. In the case of Catherine Hewitt, she was called Mould Heels for some reason. That was her nickname. And as you quite rightly say, Elizabeth Southern was called Demdike. Must have been, again, an insulting name, really, but quite sad names, really, aren't they, when you think of it?
Absolutely.
Sorry, Joe, can I just cut in just for 2 seconds just to say hi to Thomas? He's on the chat. Folks, Thomas Broad, he's the Pendle Witch blog, same as Simon, another expert, same as Cam and Joe as well, another expert on the Pendle story. He's been helping us as well throughout our Forgotten Pendle. So good evening, Thomas, and thanks for joining us, buddy. Sorry, folks, carry on. I just wanted to say hi to Thomas because I saw his name pop up.
Okay, so going back to, so they were kept in there for 4 months.
4 months is a very long time, isn't it, really? And you can imagine total darkness. It's a form of torture, let's be honest. And when you look at poor Elizabeth Southern, I mean, she was over 85 years old. And as Karen mentioned, that's a long, long walk for a lady that age. It really, really is. Probably poor footwear, as you quite rightly say. And then the quality of the food would have probably been bread and water. And when we say bread, it would have been pretty stale bread, really. The conditions must have been horrible, absolutely horrible.
So they're kept in darkness, Shelley. How can we're talking about the conditions? How
Yeah.
What do you think? What's your take on that one?
Well, I think, well, personally, for what I've learned over these last wee while, it was so dark, and you've got to remember that even some of them couldn't even see, like Chattox and Thames, their vision was really, really poor. And then you've also got all the water that was lying, and then they would never have cleaned these out. They wouldn't have made a habit of cleaning out these areas. So you've all the bodily fluids coming out. There was nowhere, no sanitation. It's just the thought of even spending one night in that cell would have been horrible. And obviously, because it's, as you said earlier on, the Chattox family and the Demdikes, they did not get on, you know, and so you had the different ages as well. Obviously, the older ladies, they couldn't really see, but everybody would have spoke in that one bit because they were all crammed in together. So you can just imagine between that, the rats, the jailers, and just how they were treated. I just don't think I could have coped with it. And in the days, they must have been terrified. And to last 4 months there, it's no wonder them dykes succumbed to the to being in there. Really, it pretty much says it all.
Yeah. Well, I think when I did obviously a little bit of research into kind of what they kind of said about each other, I think I read that it was quoted that they could see a grill, or that what is a grill now. They could slightly see the bottom, which was where the most of the rainwater was coming in, and in the daytime, Demdike would look up to this grill and she would call to her familiar in mumbled curses and prayers to try and ask it to free her. Now, whether she died or whether her familiar came and collected her would be a choice of belief, I suppose, as to whether it did actually come and free her from this terrible, terrible place, or whether, again, victim of circumstance more than ever, came and took a stronghold on her. But we know, sadly, well, I say sadly, it was not, it is, but it isn't, because she died unconvicted. She died not convicted as being a witch, because obviously they couldn't try her. That's right, isn't it? I'm sure.
Yes. Although she was taken as one. I think Thomas Potts calls her a most odious witch, and describes her in those kind of terms. So she was assumed to be a witch,
as good
as being tried. But actually, she escaped. I think she died in May, so she escaped June, July, and August in there. She escaped seeing all her family, her daughter, her grandchildren being convicted, and she escaped the gallows as well.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
In a way, she may have been the best off, which is a sad thing to think about and say.
So I'm just looking at the comment that we have up on the screen. Were the dogs convicted as well? I'm guessing by the dogs you mean familiars.
I think that's what they must have been. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so, Mr. K. Is that what you're meaning? All the familiars with the familiars convicted?
yeses, I think she said.
Okay. It would be incredibly hard, I think, to pull a spirit dog, because I know that it's quoted. Little Jeanette Device then quotes, "My mother is a witch, and I know this to be true. I have seen her spirit in the form of a brown dog, in which she called Ball. When the dog appears, it asks her, 'What shall you have me do?' She replies, 'Help me kill.'" So whether a dog could be convicted, no, I wouldn't have thought so. No, I wouldn't have thought so.
Cats were convicted and hanged. I was just going to say, is there no cases throughout history of animals actually being convicted?
Not anywhere in this. Not in anywhere in this. Not in this trial. Certain things and certain parts of animals were seen to protect you from witchcraft. So a dog's heart with 9 nails, perhaps, would be a sign of protection. We look at the idea of one of the locations for Malkin Tower where a cat was found buried alive in the walls. So I think by talking about animals, we are slightly diversing from our pendle too. However, I would be more than happy to run a live talking about animals and how they play their part in witchcraft, because I think animals are huge, but however, to be convicted in Pendle, it wasn't the case. It was used as quite strong evidence, I do believe. I mean, Simon, what do you think? Do you think that the familiar's evidence was pretty strong?
There is a connection that day, August 20th, 1612, where the Samlesbury witches were brought up at the same time. When I say Samlesbury witches, they came from Samlesbury Hall. Jane Southworth, Jean and Ellen Braley, two twin sisters. And the connection with them took place many, many years later when research was looked into their story, where they met a young girl called Gracie Sarberts. And Gracie, she was the head gardener's daughter from Samlesbury Hall. And she was brought into the courts at Lancaster, just like little Jeanette was, placed on top of a desk. And James Altham, Edmund Brobdin said, "Read out your testimony against these witches," pointed towards Jane Southworth and the 2 Braley sisters. And she said, "I will, sir. I was walking along the banks of the River Ribble, sir. It was a very, very hot summer's day when I saw Jane Southworth and the 2 Braley sisters swimming in the river, sir. I then saw these unusual dogs. I've never seen the breed before, sir. They had like long backs, long tails, cloven hooves. And they jumped into the river, sir. They materialized into human beings and picked up all 3 women, danced in a circle, paired off for a meal. And then I watched from a distance, sir, as fraternization was taking place with these demonic spectres. On the second day, Ellen Braley came to see me. She said, 'Would like to have some fun, Gracie?' I said, 'What do you mean fun?' 'Well, a little boy's been born at Samlesbury Hall called Thomas Walshman. We'd like to drink his blood.' 'No, said Gracie. 'I don't believe in that sort of thing.' James Altham was about to pick up the gavel to find them guilty when his companion, Bromley, said, No, let her finish her testimony. Sir, in the dead of night, they went back to Samlesbury Hall. They went up to the long gallery where the little Walshman boy was sleeping. They picked him up from his cot, sir, and over 3 nights they pricked his stomach and consumed his blood. He died, sir. He was then interned in the local cemetery. In the early hours of the morning, sir, they came back. They dug up the coffin. They took the baby out the coffin. They boiled the baby's flesh. They consumed the flesh and kept some body that would enable them to change shape. James Altham was livid. 'Right, we find you guilty. You'll die like the rest.' Before the gavel came down, Jane Southworth pulled off what we can only describe really as a short miracle. 'Sir, I beg of you to cross-examine this young girl, sir. She's been manipulated by a Catholic priest called Thompson, hiding at Samlesbury Hall, sir.' That one word, Catholicism, made them all sit back. 'You're an Anglican, you say?' 'Yes, sir. I'm married to the Southworth family. They're all Catholic. They hate me, sir, because of my Anglican views, sir. This young girl's been manipulated by a Catholic priest to falsely incriminate myself and my 2 friends, sir. Please cross-examine her.' They took Gracie out of the courts. You can only imagine Jane and the 2 sisters must have felt terrified, waiting. Would they live or would they die? The judges came back into the courts, reassembled the courts. In the light of new evidence, we find you, Jane Southworth, you, Jean Ellen Brearley, innocent of the crimes against you. You're free to go. The three of them left the courts that day, elated. As Jane left the city of Lancaster, she turned and saw the pillory, saw the pendle hanging and blowing in the wind. At the end of the pillory, she saw 3 empty nooses and realised she'd saved her neck and her 2 friends as well. But to get to your story now, the connection with the dogs, what we do know is some 205 years later, in the little village of Worley near Clitheroe, 2 local doctors, Dr. Whittaker, Dr. Dawson, sat down in front of a glowing fire with a glass of punch. And Whittaker said to Dawson, they'd just been discussing the Pendlewich story and the Samlesbury Hall defendants. And Whittaker said to Dawson, I believe young Grace was telling the truth. How? Well, the way she's explained these 3 dogs that were in the River Ribble sound very like Tib, Ball and Fancy, belonging to Demdike, Chattox and Redfern. And remember, she would not have been in court that day, so it's amazing how she managed to describe them in perfect detail. But also, let's get permission from the Archbishop of York to exhume the Walshman grave. They wrote to York Minster, and York Minster dispatched the Reverend John Franks, and they got permission to exhume the Walshman grave. They got the grave records, and they paced out exactly where the coffin was, and they started to dig. Just 2 feet beneath the surface, they came across a lozenge-shaped child's coffin with a metal band around it, a lozenge-shaped coffin. Under Church of England supervision, it was opened and found to contain absolutely nothing. Who knows, young Gracie Sarberts may just have been telling the truth, and she too may have seen those familiars belonging to the Pendle witches. We shall never, ever know.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for that, Simon, because we did we touched on the Samlesbury witches with Karen's book.
Yes.
And one of the questions that come through was, well, why didn't they just, go and have a look? Why didn't they exhume the grave? So obviously it was done, but some 205 years later.
Yes. Well, it's amazing, even to this very, very day, historians tend to argue between the Pendle witches and the Samlesbury Hall witches. We do know through Thomas Potts's book that they were tried the same day under James Altham, Edmund Bromley, Thomas Potts, Roger Nowell, Holden and Bannister. We know that actually definitely happened, but they were acquitted. And there was a girl called Alice Gray that came from Cone. She was also acquitted with Isabel Sigrose and John Ramsden. And they came under what we call the Samlesbury Hall witches. But we do know that Captain Hewitt's friend Alice Gray came from Cone. So there's a bit of Thomas Potts's book that's a little bit confusing there, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So back to the darkness, and the door finally creaks open, and blazing sun, which would have been a summer's day, comes belting down the stairs and into hell. They're then led up the stairs and into a courtroom in what they were wearing, and what they looked like in what they were wearing. They were then stood one at a time and tried for crimes which probably would have seemed a lifetime ago to them. If they had done them, they probably couldn't have remembered, or if they could, did they want to remember? So that we know our Mother Demdike had passed before the trial, so she had passed before the 18th of August. It then fell, as quite rightly as Simon says, to her daughter, Elizabeth, which we spoke about her a little bit this morning, was disfigured at birth. So one eye was slightly higher than the other. She had a hunchback. She walked with a limp. She kind of dragged her leg along behind her. She then stood trial for the murder of James and John Robertson.
Robinson, yeah, and Henry Mitten.
And she was, yes, but she wasn't the only one, was she, Simon, with the Henry Mitten? She wasn't the only one there.
No. Henry Mitten came from Roughly, and Alice Nutter was found guilty of of aiding in his death, because he was with Alison Device and Elizabeth Southern. And Alison and her grandmother used to link arms because she was practically blind and would go to all the villages. She was her eyes, really. But according to the evidence given by young Jeanette Device, and indeed this self-incrimination that came from James Device, is that Alice had been with Alison Device and Elizabeth Southern in Roughly and had cursed Henry Benton because he wouldn't give them a penny. I do find that quite amazing, really, because Alice Nutter would not have needed to beg. She was, according to what we believe, a woman of wealth. And if you've seen Roughly Hall, it's a beautiful building. It's now surrounded by a modern housing estate. And it's a gorgeous building to look at. And you can imagine when she lived there with her husband, it would have been beautiful, beautiful, wealthy area to live. And she would have been quite a substantial lady, really, as well.
So then we know that Elizabeth obviously had her three children. So she had little Jeanette that wasn't arrested. Then she obviously had her son James. Now he, I believe, was tried as you've said, Simon, in a lot more detail than what I'm going to touch on. Anne Townley and John Duckworth.
Yes, Anne Townley, John Duckworth, and Hugh and Blaise Hargreaves. Apparently, his familiar was called Ball, a dog called Ball. And young Jeanette told the court how she'd seen Ball arrive at Malkin Tower. And in the case of James, he actually self-incriminated himself by mentioning that John Duckworth had promised him a shirt, and this shirt didn't materialise. In the case of Anne Townley, she came from Townley Hall, Burnley, and from what we understand, there was this beautiful pie that had been cooked there and had been placed on a windowsill to cool down, and he tried to grab it, and he'd run away, and she'd hit him in the back, and she died sometime afterwards, really. But he was put down to witchcraft, put down to the fact that she'd had a confrontation with James Device. He was classed as a bit of a dimwit, apparently, self-incriminated, but he did mention these clay pictures, and he did mention to the sheriffs of the forest, called Hargreaves, that if he went to Malkin Tower, just where the actual door is, they could find a clay picture which apparently had human hair and human teeth, and apparently we understand it was actually found there.
And then, Karen, if I come to you for this one, or Shelley, if you can share this one. Alison Device, she didn't actually murder anybody, though, did she? However, she was accused of using witchcraft.
Yes, that's right. She didn't actually. Yeah, she didn't actually. She wasn't. She never actually killed anybody through the Paranormal crash. It was because of John Law. She confessed herself to what happened to John Law for maiming him through cursing him, basically. And when she went to court, she was hell bent in remorse. She just thought that it was her fault that he collapsed the way he did, because she never really knew any better. So yeah, it was Alison that confessed herself.
So sticking to that family first, let's look at that poor family to start with. So Elizabeth is
just a moment, Joe. It's showing on Facebook as the live video is interrupted. The broadcast has been paused. I think with Scott going off.
Oh,
we're back.
It seems to be still going from my end.
Are we keep going?
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, we're okay.
Okay, so let's just stick with that family then. So we know that quite a few of the accused and the tried remained completely silent, whether it be their mindset that they were in, or whether they just felt, because they were defendants, they weren't allowed to defend themselves, and they definitely weren't allowed anybody to defend them. No. So whether they just thought there's no point because I'm fighting a losing battle from the beginning, perhaps. Except Elizabeth really did try to defend herself, and as Simon says, in quite a fiery manner. She was a screaming banshee in the court. And then to have her daughter brought in, who, as you know, as we've said, to proclaim to be around 9, 10, 11 years old, the words that were about to come out of that little girl's mouth, was the be all and end all of it all. Was she screaming at her daughter because she knew her daughter would tell the truth, or was she screaming at her daughter to get her to realize what she was actually doing?
I think she would have been very shocked to see her. You don't forget, she'd been under sensory deprivation for months. She was suddenly brought into a courtroom, so not a light, noise, lots of people, and on trial for their lives. So she would have been in a state of shock. We also don't know just how mentally her mental capabilities were. You've talked about her disfigurements. It's possible that she either had a very difficult birthing or was dropped as a baby. There's also mention within Thomas Potts's book of her asking Demdike to go and collect money for her that she'd earned. But I mean, why wouldn't she do it herself? She was in her early 40s. Why ask her 8-year-old mother? So there are signs there that she wasn't. She would not be able to express herself well. Let's put it that way. And it would have been a further shock to see Janet as well. I mean, in 4 months, she would have grown, and she would have grown a lot, and also put on weight. She would have looked healthier than she'd ever seen her before because of all the food and living at Reed Hall with Roger Noel and his family. Nice clothes, obviously attached to the man who gave her all these fineries and these luxuries. And the only way she could communicate was at the top of her voice and shouting. I mean, how often do we get our emotions mixed up when we're in under extreme emotion, whether extreme fear, extreme worry, maybe relief at seeing her, and it comes out as shouting. It happens all the time.
Very good point.
I thought you were dead. I'm going to kill you for that. And it's so she would have been in a terrible state, and if she couldn't express herself, if she couldn't communicate well, that just would have been heightened. And she just screamed and screamed at Janet, trying to get her to understand what was happening, trying to get her to stop, to shut up, to stop making it any worse. Which Janet wouldn't have known, because Roger Noel wouldn't have told her. He didn't want her to know what the consequences would be. And Janet turned around and said, I can't talk with my mother here. Can you take her away, please? And they did.
Simon says, and to that point, she had her audience, did she? She was Roger Noel's pawn in all of this.
His little pet.
As we mentioned, you know, if anybody, you know, wants to watch our lives, they're all on there, aren't they? From where we've discussed who was who and who perhaps did what. So, but also something that I find incredibly sad is poor James. Even if he wasn't accused of witchcraft, we know that they had quite a feast at Malkin Tower on that Good Friday meeting. And what did they feast on? A stolen sheep. So even if he wasn't tried for witchcraft, he'd already stolen a sheep. And in 1612, you were hung for stealing sheep. So his back was against the wall whichever way, you know, this poor simple boy could have turned. So in theory, that a whole family is gone on the words of one of their own.
And for James as well, if he was told, oh, well, you've stolen a sheep, we can hang you for that. You've admitted to it. We know you have. So if you tell us about what was going on at that meeting, if you tell us about everybody else who was there, then we can forget about the sheep. And then, of course, not telling him about the consequences of what he was admitting. And if you believe them, then that could well be why he spilled so much and implicated virtually his entire family.
Yeah.
as well as others as well.
So then, again, as Simon's mentioned, John and Jane Bulcock. Now, there's not much that's really documented in the court accounts for them, apart from the fact that there was a connection with, I think, is it Janet Dean? Would that be right, Simon? Did they have a connection with her?
Yes, yeah. From West Yorkshire. She was a young girl, apparently, and the courts found her guilty of turning her completely insane. They made pleas of not guilty, but the jury found them guilty mainly because of young Jeanette standing on the table and pointed them out as being at the Good Friday meeting. But again, the evidence against them with regards to the witchcraft could have been fabricated. It's hard to say, really. It's this side which is still shrouded in mystery, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think John was pointed out by little Jeanette as to, you were there because you turned the sheep, you turned the spit.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So then moving on, we go to Catherine Hewitt, who had gained the name Moleheels. Now, I've heard many different versions of why she got this name. One, it's reputed, but her skin and she had these smelly boils and blisters on her feet, and her skin was peeling off. That wasn't the case, apparently. Does anybody know why she had that nickname?
It was to do with her husband's job. Was he something to do? I can't remember exactly. Something to do with cloth and the way it was treated. And if it wasn't done properly, then it would go mouldy. And the heels of cloth, I think. Thomas may well correct me because I'm a little bit hazy on those details. I'm still researching up to that. But I mean, it could be either. There's good cases for either. So was she Moleheels or was she wife of Moleheels? We've only got Thomas Potter's account really to guess.
Yeah.
Maybe Thomas can answer that one, or Simon as well.
But so her moving on from her nickname, she was connected. I think again, Simon, please correct me, or aid me in this. Anne Folds, she was connected to something to do with a lady called Anne Folds.
She was the victim. Anne Folds was the victim apparently, and she'd been cursed by Catherine Hewitt in Cone apparently, along with Alice Gray. But Alice Gray is the one that seems to have got off the offence. Again, Potts doesn't really go deeply into this, does he? Really? But he mentions something to do with a horse that was cursed as well. By Catherine Hewitt, but she's certainly quite a character regarding the actual trial. She's certainly mentioned and convicted, and was actually found guilty by the courts, of course, but also made a plea of guilty as well. I understand, almost like self-incriminating.
Okay, which is quite something, because everybody up to now has pleaded not guilty but found guilty.
Yeah, very much so. But don't forget that James self-incriminated, his sister Alison self-incriminated, and of course Jeanette Devise, the younger sister, she told the whole court what had happened. And the jury, of course, believed everything that was said. Really, they couldn't deny it. But I said the people I feel really sorry for would be John and Jane Bulcock and Alice Nutter, because I think that in many ways they were brought in for a different reason. There's a lot of mystery surrounding those three. And there has been talk of the three of them complaining about land disputes and embarrassing Roger Nowell because he did nothing about it. And there's talk of them going to Lancaster and seeing the senior magistrates and winning their cases. And Nowell thought, I need revenge. I need to get rid of these people. How can I? I've got the trump card. Little Jeanette Devise. And Jeanette was put on top of the desk again and told the court how she'd seen all three of them at Malkin Tower on Good Friday, 1612.
And then our second, as we call them, our feuding Pendle families, would have been Anne Whittle, Chattox, the murder of Robert Nutter, and something to do with turning beer sour. Was it amongst her?
Well, I think out of all the so-called pendle witches, she's the one that people seem to call the most dangerous. And certainly she was found guilty of the murder of 5 local people. But don't forget, you know, that the families have all incriminated her. Anne Whittle and Elizabeth Southern, they, as you quite rightly said, Karen, they didn't like each other at all. They hated each other. There's a lot of hatred towards them. And I should imagine that when the 4 of them were arrested, with Anne Redfern and Alison Device, when they were interviewed by Noel, there must have been a lot of tension. And I'm sure that Whittle would try and put the blame entirely on Chattox's shoulder, and backwards again. You know, Demdike and Chattox would have blamed each other, really. But in the case of Anne Whittle, she was found guilty of the murder of Robert and Anne Nutter, of John Moore Hugh and indeed John Devise, who would have been related to the Devise family. So there's no love between them whatsoever.
No, not at all. Not at all. And then her daughter, Anne Redfern, I believe, she kind of stood trial twice. She stood trial once in the morning on the accusation of Robert Nutter and was acquitted.
Yeah.
She then was brought back and stood trial again for Christopher Nutter.
Yes, quite true. And again, you've got to really feel for this girl, because through the legends of the forest, etc., we are told that in the case of Christopher Nutter, he tried to basically rape the poor girl, and she refused his attentions. And as a result, you know, way back in 1612, women had no rights whatsoever. It was believed by some men that women didn't even have a brain, and when it came to male chauvinism, women suffered terribly. And again, I feel really, really sorry for him, because so we are told through the legends, through the stories that filter through from Potts's book, that she'd been molested by him, and she would not allow him to have his wicked way with her, and so therefore she was incriminated. But it is quite confusing, because a lot of the victims have the same name as the witches. I mean, which makes the whole story quite confusing, really. But when I look at the Pendle story, I like look at it almost like a football field, because Newchurch, Barley, Blacko, Downham, roughly, they're all very close together. And you can imagine in 1612, it would have been a huge forest with little clearings in between each forest. But everything would have been very, very close. So a lot of intermarriages, if you will.
We just quite a point there from Thomas. Anne Folds' father was called Nicholas, and he appears to have had a son called Miles, who also died in infancy. Miles isn't mentioned in Potts's account, but his death may have contributed towards the allegations against Catherine Hewitt and Alice Gray. Wow. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. You couldn't disagree, I don't think, to be fair.
Right. And Nicholas also died in 1610, not long after Miles, so it's all around that time.
Absolutely.
So it could easily have been that was just brought in and they used it to find a way, and just to add to the weight of accusations against her if they wanted rid.
And then, of course, we've spoken about Alice Nutter, and I think her only thing was a connection to Henry Mitten and the penny, and quite rightly, she would have had no need to beg. She would have had no need to beg. Religion, again, back to that word. She'd had uncles that had, well, I think they'd been hung, drawn, and quartered for being Catholics. And was her religion something that stood in the way? Did she, behind closed doors, perhaps tell Roger Nowell exactly what she thought of him, and had an argument or two, and he thought, do you know what, this woman's trouble, and looked for a reason to get rid of her. Lo and behold, Alice was charitable. You know, she was known to do good things. Was she riding past Malkin Tower on Good Friday and thought, do you know what, the Dendykes have had a bit of a tough time. I'm going to drop them off this loaf of bread and just make sure they're okay. Oh, Alice, while you're here, why don't you come on in for a nice cup of ale? Jump off your horse. That was enough to have her in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yes, as a Catholic, and assuming she was Catholic, which I think is a fair assumption, given the records and details that we do have, her attitude to poverty was very different to the Protestants and the Puritan magistrates. They believed that if you were poor, it's because you'd offended God and you were born into that state for a reason, and you deserved it. But the Catholic, of course, version or attitude, as we saw in the monasteries, was they gave alms, and that was a long Catholic tradition to help people. And of course, Alice lived not very far away. As a Catholic, it's possible that she didn't go to the parish church over the Easter holidays, which would have been a big black mark against her.
There was a law.
King James had, it was law to go to parish church, and King James had issued an edict to all the magistrates in the whole country to make a list of anybody who did not go to the parish church over Easter and take communion. And if somebody didn't go, then they were hauled up at the Easter assizes. So maybe she was missed, and they brought her up for on the August assizes as well for witchcraft. Maybe she came up and Roger Nowell thought she got off too lightly. Maybe it was an excuse to get rid of an older woman again, possibly with dementia, possibly a nuisance to her family, a nuisance to the other neighbouring landowners. And it was, and he took the opportunity and got rid. Although I think Simon has a different theory, don't you, Simon?
It's hard to say. There's so much mystery surrounding her, really. A huge amount of mystery. I do know that in New Church Cemetery, there's a grave there, and everyone calls it the witch's grave. But I've had a look at the grave, and it mentions an Ellen Nutter, who I presume may have been her daughter, actually. I presume. I don't know. But many people feel that it would be impossible to actually bury a convicted witch in consecrated ground. And although I don't know personally, because Potts doesn't mention it, but I get the impression that when these poor unfortunate people were cut down, it wouldn't surprise if their bodies were burnt to get rid of the corpses, really, because there's no actual mention of any grave in Lancaster. So there could have been a funeral pyre. Again, it is a far-fetched idea, but quite possible that Alice's husband may have paid to have a body brought back and had it secretly buried at New Church. But I find that one hard to believe, really. But it is possible, I suppose.
In the dead of night, would have crept back. I mean, I've heard from talking to a few of the local people, just going back to the grave, that the tomb was opened and she was placed inside. And the following spring, strange things were happening to whole herds of animals, 2 heads, 3 legs, not just the odd one, but quite a lot of the flock. And they put it down to the curse of the witch. So they reopened the tomb. They put a stake through her heart. They turned her over face down so she couldn't rise again, and they sealed the tomb. Do I personally believe that she would be in there? I don't know. No, I don't think that she would. But we know that they were all tried, they were all convicted, and they all were hung. They were strangled by their own weight to their own death. Were they victims of persecution, or were they witches? In 1612, there was no skin tests like we have nowadays. There was nothing to test if you were allergic to a stinging nettle. So if you went to see your local cunning woman and she said, oh, here's a little bottle of this ointment, rub this in twice a day, took you a couple of pence and away you would go, then all of a sudden your hands would begin to swell, your chest would become tight, your neck, your face, your eyes would bulge. So look at it. 3 hours ago, she was visiting the cunning woman. And now look at her. She's been cursed. Except it was simple. It was an allergic reaction to something. But this wasn't something you couldn't just wake up and think, oh, it's Tuesday, I'm going to be a cunning woman on a Tuesday. It had to be something that was learned. And learned for a long, long time. I think it passes down through generations, you know, the knowledge of something like this. And did they have the power to know what they were doing and to who? Yeah, I think they probably, yeah, they did. But did the things that they were accused of, did they deserve that? I don't believe that they did. Shelley, what do you think on the whole?
Well, I definitely don't think they deserved what they got. I think there's too much corruption and manipulation and through all the different kind of reasons why they would try and get these people out the road through religion, through land, through basically just payback as well. You know, they were all kind of getting themselves together and just condemning each other, and from the magistrates and whatever trying to condemn them. I don't think they did deserve it. I don't think they grew up in generations passing on skills from one mother to the next mother to be then hung, you know, to be then slammed in the jail. It's certainly not something they would have meant to have happened. They would never have knew that was such a bad thing. It was just a case that if something had happened, then it was convenient enough for them to be blamed. And then that's when the accusations between each other all kind of kicked in. And of course, because of all the paranoia and because of how rife it was, I don't even think they knew themselves what they were doing. In the case of Alison Device, when John Law, when he collapsed, she wouldn't have known right away that was her that caused that until she'd seen the effects of it. And then she really did start to believe that the stuff that she was doing was it was capable enough to do that to somebody. So I think they didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't think they knew that how bad the consequences were of learning how to help people, you know. But all in different cases, like people, as you say, kind of getting allergic reactions, or if you were helping like a pregnant lady, you know, and problems with childbirth.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a horrible, horrible time. And as far as another thing, what I was going to pipe in earlier on, but we were talking in the case of Janet Device. You know, one thing I've learned doing these pendle lives, you know, there's a saying, and I don't know if everybody's got this saying, but when your children kind of make you out to be a liar, and you say, "Oh, these children, they'll get you hung," it takes you straight back to the years when people were getting tried and hung for witchcraft, and I never. It's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, from the words of children.
Yeah.
So they're stood in the courtroom, they're found guilty, and they're taken back to the cells. Where do they go from there? Do they go straight up to Gallows Hill? I've heard two sides of this tale. That one says that they got to spend their last night in the Three Mariners pub just down the road from the castle. I've heard another tale that they were kept back to the Well Tower dungeon cell. The door creaked open the following day, and they were taken by horse and cart, sitting on their own coffins to stop at the Red Lion Inn, and then carried on their journey up to Williamson Park. What do you think on that, Simon?
Well, again, we have to just rely entirely on Potts's book, really. The only thing I know is that they were executed on the 20th of August, 1612. How they got there, I don't know. I presume they may have had to walk the city of Lancaster. Whether they'd be allowed a drink, I mean, who would actually pay for the drink? I mean, it's hard to say, really, isn't it? I know that it was tradition to have a drink there before you actually went to your death. But whether this was the case, I don't know if Potts actually mentioned that, really. For the Pendle Witches.
Yeah, Simon says it's quite right. He says it's tradition, and that's where a couple of very common sayings come. You're off the wagon, because they come off the wagon to have the drink, and they have one for the road.
Yeah.
And that's where those two sayings come from.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's quite right.
So still that part remains a bit of a mystery then as to how they got there. And can you imagine how they must have felt? Convicted witches walking or riding the streets of Lancaster, either on the back of a flatbed cart, either sitting on their coffins or being chained together. And it's quite a walk from the castle up to Williamson Park. It's quite a walk. For if you're fitting well, let alone if you've been incarcerated for 4 months and had to stand persecution for 3 days. The people wouldn't have been very I say they wouldn't have been very kind. I think that a lot of them would have been quite feared of them. Because don't forget, these ladies and these gentlemen, these are witches. They're not, and I'm not dulling it down by any sense, but they're not murderers or they're not thieves. These are witches. So, and the fear that would have gone through the streets of Lancaster on that day must have been absolutely astronomical. Must have really been something else.
And celebration as well. Hanging Day was a big celebration. It happened once a quarter, and it was a big day out for a lot of people, quite a spectacle. So they'd been convicted, and they'd have been shackled in iron, because iron was reputed to stay a witch's powers. So that's why they would have chosen iron. So that would have given, or maybe a little bit of feeling of security, but I can't imagine it would give a great deal. But yeah, I would imagine that just from the cart or walking, just a glare or a word at people would have terrified them. And
absolutely.
Then on Gallows Hill, there would have been stalls. It would have been almost like a fair atmosphere. But for something so gruesome, it's very difficult to get your head around that now, living in the 21st century. As these events were taken. Yeah,
definitely. And then we talk up to their final moments where they weren't all hung together, were they? I don't believe they were all hung, all 9, 10, 11, 12, all these nooses that were lined up. They were hung separately. Was it maybe 3 or 4, Simon, I think, at a time?
I really don't know about that. I really don't. I will be honest. I know that they were joined by a lady called Isabel Roby. She was convicted. She came from a place called Windle, which is near St. Helens. From reading Potts's book, I don't think it actually mentions that really, but I know they all lost their lives the same day. But the pillory is quite an evil-looking piece of mechanism, really. Whether they could get 12 people on that at the same time, I don't know, but I got the impression they were dispatched at the same time. But again, I wasn't there, so I don't know really.
No. The tales we could tell if we were, though, perhaps. We'd give Thomas Potts a good run for his money. I'm sure Karen would, anyway.
I'll do my best.
You do?
I know. I think a lot of I just saw a comment that I'd just like to bring up, a comment from Maureen about the dates on what was said to be the witch's grave. I agree with you, Maureen, yes, and Thomas can confirm that the grave is a lot newer than 1612. It's impossible to know for sure. The same is true for them being imprisoned in the Well Tower. It could be true, but it could also be local folklore. As an example, the witches of the 1634 trials were imprisoned in a cell below the Ogley and Henry Burton within the castle. Oh, well, that gives a whole new take on things. As to maybe they were kept in the Well Tower for some of it, and then the last night was in another cell, or
yes, I think they were holding cells beneath the courtroom. So they would have been moved into there certainly before the trial, but whether it was the night before, we just don't know. We just don't know. No, which is great for me as an author of historical fiction, because these are the blanks I get to fill in. But no, we don't know for sure.
Yeah, but that comment there, yes, Maureen. The dates on the grave for the Nutter family are later. Yes, I agree. I agree with you. They are much later. Yeah.
And you're quite right as well, Mo, that she was a widow as well. But she had an adult son, so it could be the son that paid for her. But yes, I think that's very, very unlikely that that anybody would have put up with her being buried in consecrated ground.
So that kind of brings us, I'd like to say the end, but I don't believe it is, because I don't think there'll ever be an end to this tale. Because I think as people like myself and as Simon, as it passes through generations, the story always alters, it always changes, there's always something else, there's always a bit more research, there's always a new fact that comes to light. But the sadness of this tale will grow and grow. I don't think the sadness will ever go away for this. Do they live on? Paranormal in history. Do the witches of Pendle live on? Do their spirits reside up at Williamson Park? Or have they travelled? Have they gone home? Or have they gone somewhere else? That's where I'm going to pass over to you guys and thank Karen and Simon for really helping us out and as Karen says, filling in huge gaps as to what you read in one piece of information that you find factual, and then speaking to Thomas, and then Thomas kind of sorting it out and saying, well, actually that couldn't have happened because of this and because of that, and putting all our heads together. I really think we've done a cracking job of telling the tale of our men and women, witches, if you please, of Pendle Hill, but also of the forgotten side of it. So I deeply thank you guys, and of course Shelley, because you've learned so much. You've been thrown in this and gone, right, next week you're learning this. Get a book and read it.
And can I just say, just a wee quick point to that, I have enjoyed the last weeks so much. I have learnt so much about the Pendle, the people of Pendle, the people that suffered, not only just what happened in Pendle in 1612, but how the people came from the 1500s upwards to the 1612, and I would never have been able to say that with this opportunity to learn. And so I could thank you, Karen, and I could thank you as well, Joe, and I could thank you, Thomas, and also Simon. Fantastic, it's been brilliant. So thank you all. Great. And thank you to Scott and Sarah as well. Thanks.
Yeah, for giving us this opportunity to talk about it.
Yes. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here. So kudos to they too as well.
Thank you. So, what can I say? I want to say, first of all, a big, massive thank you to Simon, to Thomas, to Karen, to Shelley, and of course to Joe. Sarah and I are over the moon at how our Forgotten Pendle series has went. It's been absolutely, we've learned so much, and we're blessed to have some of the UK's top Pendle minds. We're helping us out on it, and that's the end of our Pendle for now. But it's all leading up. We are heading down to Pendle on the 2nd of July. For 2 days, 3 days, 2nd to 4th of July. We will hope to be up with yourself, Simon, Thomas, Karen, all the great minds. So we're going to put a post up on Facebook tomorrow to give your opinion, folks. As Joe said, were they guilty? Were they innocent? My opinion is they were innocent. They were just, the only thing that they were guilty of was being different from everybody else. They kind of, because they didn't fit into normal society, this is why they were considered witches. That's my opinion. This day and age, there's loads of different people out there. Nobody's the same. But obviously back in 1612, if you were different, then
it was a big thing.
It was a big thing. There was something wrong with you. Basically, you were a witch. But we will be putting a post up on Facebook for everybody who's listened in over the last few weeks. If you've missed any, it's all on the YouTube channel, to give it a look and give your opinion. Do you think they were guilty? Do you think it would be interesting to know what, everybody who's watched, especially these ladies over the past, 5-6 weeks, what do you think? But we have learned so much, and as I say, we are Paranormal History are hitting Pendle on the 2nd of July. We're meeting up with GSI as well, the team we spoke about previously. But it's been absolutely amazing, the whole thing. And Sarah and I are glad we sounds big-headed, but we're glad we came up with the idea to do the Forgotten Pendle, because as you probably learned from Karen, Joe, Simon, Thomas, Shelley, there was a lot more to the story than people have actually read, in the history books. There was a lot more behind the scenes, for want of a better word, a lot more people involved, a lot more people's lives affected by the whole Pendle witch trials than people actually know. So we are glad that we actually came up with the idea to get these people's names out there so people can look up, Google history books and find out for themselves about these other people who were involved, because they deserve the same memory and respect as the 12 who were originally accused. I don't know if the panel agrees with that.
To do that. That's it.
Yeah.
That's right.
Because it did. Yeah, as you, the same as all the victims of all the witch trials in the UK, all over the world. There's thousand innocent people went to their deaths, all because of a superstition or a fallout with a neighbour, or because they were different from everybody else. But as you see with Pendle, there's so many strings to Pendle. As Joe said, I don't think it's a subject that ever will be closed.
No.
It's going to keep going and going, because people are learning so much, week after week about it. But we want to thank everybody for coming in, and again, our top Pendle experts. Shelley, you're now considered one of them as well, because you've had a big shovel. That's month and a half, and you're now educated. So that's it for tonight, people. We're back on Saturday with Kat from our American team, who's doing the Exorcist House. And then we're on Monday, we've got Charlotte and her teammate coming in as well. But again, to everybody who's helped us out with Pendle, a massive, massive thank you. And you've not heard the last of Pendle from Paranormal History. Trust me. There's a lot more to come. So we'll say good night just now, and stay safe till the next time we see you. Thanks to the panel. Thomas, thank you very much, my friend, for coming in. I'll talk to you very soon, buddy. So we'll say good night for now, folks, and take care.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.